For 10 long years, he spoke to no one but his horses and the wind. The rancher had buried love once, and with it, any reason to hope again. But one quiet morning, a woman appeared at his fence line, her dress dusted with road and her eyes carrying secrets the frontier couldn't hide. She asked for water, and stayed to mend a gate. By sunset, he realized she'd mended something else too, the part of him that still believed in second chances. What began as a simple kindness would stir memories, awaken feelings long buried, and prove that even the loneliest heart on the prairie can be found again. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The woman's hands were still rough from the work, splinters and dust marking the skin where she'd mended his fence, and though she had thanked him softly, she lingered by the post as if waiting for a reason to stay. The rancher told himself it was only the hour, only the heat, only a stranger's weariness that kept her standing there. And yet when he heard himself say, "You can stay for supper if you like," it was with a voice that did not sound like his own, steady but unguarded, like an old door opening after too many winters sealed shut. She nodded once, no smile, no gratitude, just that quiet acceptance that said she'd been offered far less before. And together they walked toward the house, her boots scuffing softly in the dirt behind his. Inside, the kitchen felt smaller than he remembered, the air thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and solitude. He lit a lantern, its glow stretching shadows across the table where 2 plates waited, untouched for years. He fetched bread and beans, the kind of meal that expected no company, and she took the seat opposite him without asking, her movements careful, measured, like someone who knew what it was to intrude. They ate in silence, the sound of cutlery against tin the only thing alive between them, and though he kept his eyes on his food, he could feel her presence filling the empty house like light spilling through a crack. Her hair caught the lamplight, not golden but the brown of wheat before harvest, and her eyes gray, steady, carried something unreadable, a weariness that did not beg for pity but demanded to be seen. He had lived 10 years without speaking more than a few words at a time, his voice mostly reserved for horses, for ghosts, for the wind that never answered back. Now, every breath she took seemed to press against that silence, reshaping it. When he finally looked up, she was already watching him, her spoon still halfway to her mouth, and neither moved for a heartbeat too long. "You don't ask many questions," she said quietly, her tone neither soft nor sharp but edged with a kind of testing curiosity. "Don't see much sense in asking what ain't offered," he replied, and she nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the worn boards of the table as if she could read his years there, the stains from whiskey, the scratches from restless nights, the empty chair across from him that had belonged to a memory he still couldn't bury. "You live alone out here?" she asked after a while. Not as gossip but as observation, like one soul acknowledging another's exile. He nodded once. "Mostly," he said, and the word hung there, heavy and inadequate. Because how did one explain the kind of loneliness that didn't ache anymore, that had become bone-deep and familiar? She finished her meal, pushed the plate aside, and folded her hands in her lap. The silence between them stretched again, but it had changed, no longer hollow, but waiting. He thought of asking her name, thought of asking where she was headed, but something stopped him, something that whispered that names and destinations might break whatever fragile spell had been spun in that quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a sigh, the last light of sunset slipping through the window and washing the room in gold. "Fence'll hold now," she said finally, standing, her voice distant, maybe unsure whether she was speaking of wood or something else. "It's good work," he replied, rising too. She lingered in the doorway, her shadow long across the floorboards. "Thank you for supper." "Wasn't kindness," he said, almost too quickly. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie, and the faintest hint of a smile flickered across her face, small, sad, but real. When she stepped out into the fading light, he followed her to the porch without thinking, and for the first time in years, he found himself hoping she might not walk away. The dream came to him like a wound reopened, soft at first, the rustle of skirts, the smell of cedar smoke, the low murmur of laughter that used to fill these walls before silence claimed them. And in that flicker of half-sleep he saw her again, his wife as she was before the fever took her. eyes alive with mischief, hand reaching for his across the table where lamplight trembled against her ring. She said his name. Not the hollow whisper it had become, but the way she used to like it meant something, and just before he could reach her, the light went out, and the sound of wind replaced her voice, leaving him gasping awake in the cold gray before dawn. His breath clouded the air, his shirt clinging to his back, and for a moment he didn't know where he was, only that he was alone again, the ache of memory still pulsing behind his ribs. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and heard something he hadn't heard in a decade. The rhythmic creak of the barn gate, the shuffle of boots over hay, the low murmur of someone talking to the horses. For a fleeting second, he thought the dream hadn't ended. He threw on his coat, stepped into the chill morning, and froze at the sight before him. There she was, the stranger from yesterday, her hair tied back loosely, sleeves rolled to her elbows, working the feed trough like she'd been born to it. Steam rose from the horse's breath, catching the light as the first pale streaks of dawn broke over the hills. She didn't see him at first. She was humming something soft, a tune he didn't recognize, the kind that carried both sorrow and endurance in the same breath. He watched her for a long time, torn between confusion and something else he didn't want to name. When she finally turned and noticed him, she didn't flinch or startle. She just looked at him, eyes calm, and said, "Your gray mare favors her left leg. You ought to check the hoof. Stones wedged deep." The words were matter of fact, the tone of someone who didn't ask permission to care. He nodded slowly, still trying to catch up to the sight of her there. Sunlight creeping through the barn slats and turning the dust to gold around her. "Didn't figure you'd still be here," he said, his voice rough from sleep and disbelief. "Didn't figure I'd be wanted gone," she answered, not meeting his eyes as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. The honesty in her tone struck him harder than it should have. He stepped closer, each footfall stirring the straw, and the smell of the morning hay, sweat, earth carried him back years, to mornings just like this, when his wife had hummed in the kitchen and the world had still felt whole. He wanted to speak, to say something about the dream, about how the sound of her voice had filled the same space that now echoed with this woman's hum. But the words tangled somewhere between grief and gratitude. Instead, he crouched by the mare, pried out the stone, and said quietly, "You didn't have to do all this." She paused her work, met his gaze, and replied, "I know, but maybe I needed to." He looked at her then, not as a stranger, not yet as something more, but as a person who had walked into his solitude and somehow belonged there without asking. The horses settled, the sun rose higher, and for the first time in years, the ranch felt alive, not haunted, not empty, but breathing. Still, when she smiled faintly and went back to her chores, he felt the echo of his wife's laughter ghost through the barn rafters, like a benediction or a warning, and he couldn't tell which. The storm came fast, rolling over the hills with the kind of fury that made the earth shudder before the rain even hit, and by the time the first drops struck the dust, the wind was already tearing across the plains like a thing possessed. He'd been mending the corral when the sky split open with a flash of white, and in the next breath she was there beside him, hair whipping loose, her voice nearly lost in the roar. "You can't stay out here." And though pride told him to finish the job, the sudden cold and the sheer force of her urgency pulled him toward the house before he could protest. The door slammed shut behind them just as thunder cracked close enough to rattle the glass panes, and for a moment the only sound was their breathing, hers quick and sharp, his steady but shaken. The room smelled of rain and wood smoke, the lantern light flickering against walls worn smooth by solitude. She pushed wet hair from her face, eyes catching the glow like stormlight. And he saw then how young she wasn't, how the years had carved strength and sorrow into her features the way the wind shapes stone. "This place always take the brunt of it?" she asked quietly, voice half a whisper, half a test of normalcy. "Always does," he replied, setting his rifle against the doorframe, his hand trembling just enough to betray how long it had been since he'd shared shelter with anyone. The thunder rolled again, shaking the floorboards, and she flinched not from fear, he noticed, but from some deeper memory, the kind that hides behind the eyes. She turned away, rubbing her arms for warmth, and he busied himself stoking the fire, though it hardly needed it, pretending not to watch her movements. "Storm'll pass by morning," he said after a while, though he wasn't sure if it was comfort or confession. Then I'll be gone by morning, she murmured, almost to herself, and the words landed heavier than the rain on the roof. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to, that the road was long and mean and that no soul deserved to walk it alone. But he stopped himself, afraid that any kindness from his lips would sound too much like need. The fire popped, casting bursts of orange across her face, and in that trembling light he caught the faint glint of something metallic at her throat. A locket, tarnished and dented, hanging from a thin chain. It was the kind of keepsake people carried when they had nowhere left to go, and something about it tugged at him, at the same place that had stirred when she first appeared at his fence. "Someone waiting for you?" he asked before he could stop himself. Her fingers brushed the locket, her eyes lowering. "Was?" she said simply. "Not anymore." The room filled with silence again. But it wasn't the empty kind he'd lived with for years. It was heavy, alive, the space between two lives unraveling just enough to show their scars. He poured her coffee, the gesture clumsy but sincere, and when she took it, their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that made the air hum louder than the thunder outside. She met his gaze then, really met it, and for a moment they were just two strangers bound by the same ghosts, both survivors of something unnamed. Outside, the storm raged on, water beating the roof like the pulse of a world too wild to ever be tamed. But inside the little house, the rhythm was slower, steadier, the sound of two hearts remembering what it felt like to be seen. He turned back to the fire, pretending to tend it again, though what he was really doing was hiding the flicker of hope he thought had died with his wife. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and as the thunder faded into distance, neither spoke again, because in that small, storm-lit silence, words would have been too small for what had begun to stir between them. The rain had softened by morning. A gray hush settled over the land, the air thick with the smell of wet sage and smoke, and when he poured the coffee and handed her a cup, his fingers brushed hers just long enough to notice the roughness of her skin. A working hand, but not a ranch hand's. There was a faint ridge along her palm, a pale line that caught the light when she turned her wrist to take the cup, and before he could think better of it, he said, "How'd you get that?" The question hung in the air like a shot in still water, and her reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't flinch, didn't pull her hand away, only looked down at it, eyes unreadable, as if she was seeing the mark for the first time herself. "I've been running a long time," she said, her voice low, almost tender, the words falling between them with the weight of something she couldn't yet let go of. He waited for her to say more, to fill the silence that followed. But she didn't. She sipped her coffee, staring into the steam as though it could take her somewhere else, and he saw in her expression that it wasn't just distance she carried, it was pursuit. There were people in her past, maybe places too, that she couldn't outrun, and something about the way she held herself, always half ready to bolt, never quite relaxed, told him that the road behind her was lined with more than heartbreak. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that her presence here wasn't an accident. He'd long believed that nothing good ever found its way to his ranch without a cost, and yet here she was, sitting in his kitchen like she belonged to a life he'd buried years ago. The fire popped behind them, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and when she finally looked up, there was something in her gaze that felt like both apology and warning. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly, though part of him wanted her to. She gave a small, humorless smile. "That's kind of you," she murmured. "But kindness don't always keep a man safe." The words sent a chill through him, not for their meaning, but for the way she said them, flat, practiced, like someone who'd learned it the hard way. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy, promising more. He watched her trace the rim of her mug with a fingertip, her thumb brushing absently over the scar again, and he found himself wondering who had hurt her, who she'd run from, and whether they might come looking. "You can stay till the weather clears," he offered, his voice softer than he intended. She looked at him, eyes narrowing just slightly, searching his face as if weighing whether he meant it. "You don't even know me," she said. "Don't have to," he replied, and though the words sounded steady, his chest felt tight, as if something inside him had been waiting years for a reason to open. She looked away then, toward the window, where sunlight was beginning to break through the gray. "Running don't always mean leaving," she whispered, almost to herself. "Sometimes it's the only way to stay alive." He wanted to ask what she meant, who she'd run from, what ghosts followed her footsteps. But the moment passed, swallowed by the sound of dripping eaves and distant thunder retreating into the hills. When she finally stood to refill her cup, he noticed the way she flexed her scarred hand, as though testing it against memory. And he knew then that whatever story lived behind that mark was far from over, and that, for better or worse, his quiet life had just been claimed by it. The days began to move differently after that storm, stretching longer, lighter somehow, as if the sun itself had decided to linger a little more over his patch of land. And the rancher who for 10 years had risen, worked, and eaten in silence found his rhythm breaking apart under the simple, unexpected gravity of her presence. He started talking again, at first only in fragments, short remarks about weather or cattle, the kind of small talk that had once seemed pointless, but her quiet responses, the way her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile when he spoke, pulled more from him than he'd thought he had left to give. She had a way of listening that wasn't passive. When her eyes met his, it felt like standing under open sky after too long in darkness, and he found himself laughing once, awkward and surprised, when she teased him about how crooked his fence posts leaned. That laugh startled him, rough from disuse, yet alive, and it lingered in the air between them longer than either spoke of. He began fixing those same fences the next morning, not because they needed it, but because she'd seen them, and something in him wanted her to see better. The rhythm of his hammer became a heartbeat he hadn't felt in years, every strike a defiance against the emptiness that had once been his only companion. She worked too, unasked, mending torn reins, hauling feed, humming while she did, that same quiet tune he'd first heard in the barn. He caught himself watching her from the corner of his eye, memorizing the way the wind lifted her hair, or how her hands, though scarred, moved with a care that spoke of patience and loss in equal measure. When she left his side to walk the pastures alone, the silence she left behind wasn't the familiar kind that had once wrapped him like an old coat. Now it bit at him, sharp and cold, making the air feel too still, the ranch too large. He realized, uneasily, that he'd begun to count his hours by her when she woke, when she smiled, when she sat quiet by the fire, staring into some far-off place her past still held. At night, he'd find himself listening for her footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards that reminded him he wasn't alone. He told himself it was nothing, just the shock of company after so long adrift. But when she laughed again, a small, unguarded sound at something he'd said while working the corral, it hit him like a clean gust through the dust. He wanted her laughter, needed it, the way parched land needs rain. He started finding excuses to speak, offering coffee twice a day instead of once, pretending he needed help where he didn't, just to hear her voice answer back. The horses grew calmer around her, the ranch brighter, as if her presence had mended more than broken gates. But with each new moment of light came an undercurrent he couldn't name, a fear that it might all vanish like a mirage, leaving him stranded again in the quiet he'd once mistaken for peace. One evening, as the sun dipped red behind the hills and she sat by the fence line watching the horizon, he caught himself wishing time would stop right there, that the wind would still, the shadows freeze, and the ache that had begun to bloom in him would never have to learn what it meant to lose again. He didn't say a word, though. He just stood beside her, silent, watching the same dying light stretch across the land, knowing full well that the loneliness he'd built his life around was no longer his refuge. It was the one thing he now feared most. The bell above the store door gave a tired jingle as he stepped inside, boots scraping against the warped floorboards, the smell of dust, tobacco, and dried grain filling the small space that hadn't changed in a decade. Yet today, something in the air felt different, thicker, like a storm building unseen. The shopkeeper, old Nolan with his perpetual scowl softened by habit, looked up from the ledger with that same half-greeting he gave every man who rode in from the outskirts, but his eyes carried an edge, a flicker of unease that made the rancher pause before tipping his hat. "Morning," he muttered, keeping his tone even, though his mind was already back at the ranch, picturing her tending the corral, sunlight catching the stray strands of her brown hair. He'd meant to grab only flour, coffee, and nails, nothing more. But as Nolan leaned on the counter, a strange look came over his face. "You been up in the hills long, friend?" the man asked, his voice casual in the way a rattlesnake sounds before it strikes. The rancher nodded once, wary. "Ain't much else to do there," he said. Nolan scratched his chin, pretending to read the label on a tin of beans before adding, "Word come through from Red Bluff. Lawmen ridin' from 2 counties over huntin' a woman. Dangerous sort, they say. Stole from her employer, maybe worse. Some claim she shot a man down in Abilene." The rancher's stomach twisted, his hand tightening on the edge of the counter. "A woman?" he asked, though the question came out strained, too sharp. Nolan nodded, lowering his voice like he was sharing gossip that stank of truth. "Brown hair, late 20s maybe. Scar along her left hand runs from the base of the thumb clear across the palm. Pretty, by some accounts. Talks quiet. They say she's headed west, maybe hiding on one of the outer ranches." The words hit him like buckshot, each detail landing where his heart had left no armor. He forced himself to breathe, to keep his face steady, to play the part of the man who didn't have something to lose. "You seen her?" Nolan asked, eyes narrowing just enough to turn the air in the room to iron. The rancher met his gaze, shook his head once. "No women out my way." He lied, voice calm but hollow. Nolan studied him for a moment, then shrugged and reached for a paper sack. "Keep it that way," he said. "Law's ridin' hard, and rumors got long legs. Wouldn't be wise to get tangled in someone else's trouble." The rancher nodded, muttered his thanks, and paid, his hands stiff as wood as he packed his supplies. He stepped out into the sunlight that now seemed cruelly bright. Every sound hoofbeats, wind, voices from the saloon suddenly too sharp, too close. The road back to the ranch stretched long and familiar, but his thoughts ran wild the whole way, each hoofbeat echoing with a question he didn't want answered. By the time the house came into view, dusk had begun to fall, the light soft and golden, and there she was sitting on the porch steps, sleeves rolled up, mending one of his old bridles, the same scar glinting faintly in the last of the Sunday. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, and that simple sight, her smile, her stillness, tore him in two. He dismounted slowly, every motion deliberate, the weight of the truth pressing heavier with each step. She was the woman they wanted, the one he'd unknowingly given shelter to, the one whose presence had awakened something too fragile, too human, to bear another betrayal. She rose as he approached, eyes searching his face. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. He tried to answer, but his throat locked, his heart pounding in the space between what he knew and what he wished wasn't true. The scar on her hand caught the dying light again, and in that moment, he realized that the question wasn't whether she'd lied, it was whether he had the strength to care. The sun was sliding low when he rode back into the yard, the air thick with that stillness that comes before a reckoning, his mind a tangle of dust and doubt as the horse's hooves thudded softly against the hard-packed earth. He saw her sitting by the trough, washing the day's dirt from her hands, the water glinting gold in the dying light, and for a moment he almost turned away, almost kept the lie safe inside him where it couldn't do harm, but the sight of her, the fragile calm she wore like borrowed peace, broke something inside him that had already been cracking since the shopkeeper's words. She looked up when she heard the reins creak, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "You're late," she said, trying for lightness, but her tone carried a tremor, the same quiet intuition that always seemed to read him too well. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against gravel, each step heavier than the last. "Stopped in town," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Heard talk." Her eyes stilled on him, cautious now. "What kind of talk?" He hesitated, the words tasting bitter before they left his tongue. "They're looking for a woman, brown hair, scar on her hand. Said she's wanted across 2 counties. Her breath caught, sharp and quiet, and for a long moment she didn't move. The silence stretched thin between them, trembling like a wire about to snap. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and met his gaze head-on. Her expression neither denial nor fear, but the weary acceptance of someone too tired to keep running. "They told you I was dangerous, didn't they?" she asked softly. He nodded once, unable to lie. "Then I suppose it's time you heard the rest." She turned away from him, looking out toward the hills where the sky burned orange and violet, and when she spoke again, Her voice was steady but hollowed by memory. "He was my husband. Name's Fletcher. Owns half of Red Bluff, maybe more by now. He doesn't take kindly to what he calls disobedience. When I left, he sent men to bring me back. When they couldn't, he told the law I'd stolen from him. Guess that's the only story men like him know how to tell. Woman runs. She's a thief. Woman speaks. She's a liar." Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it, showing the pale line that cut across her palm. "That's from him. Said if I ever tried to leave again, he'd finish it." The rancher's stomach turned, his anger flaring hot and useless. "You could have told me," he said, though the accusation faltered as soon as it met her eyes. "And you would have done what? Sent me away to keep your conscience clean?" she asked. Not cruelly, just honest, and that honesty stung more than any lie could have. He didn't answer. The wind picked up, stirring dust around their boots, the horses shifting uneasily in the corral as thunder rolled somewhere far off in the hills. "I didn't come here to hide," she said finally. "I came because I saw the smoke from your chimney and thought maybe, just maybe, there was one place left where a soul could start over without being hunted." Her voice broke a little at that, but she didn't look away. "If you want me gone, I'll go tonight. I've done it before, but I won't crawl." He stepped forward before he realized it, the distance between them closing like instinct. "Ain't saying that," he muttered, the words dragging out of him. "Just trying to understand." She gave a faint, trembling laugh, part disbelief, part relief. "Then you're already kinder than most." The sky darkened fully, shadows swallowing the last of the light. They stood there, two broken lives caught in the pause before the world decided what to do with them next. The truth now laid bare between them like a wound neither could pretend not to see. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote cried, and he thought not for the first time that maybe mercy wasn't about forgiveness at all. Maybe it was just the courage to stay when every reason said to run. The dawn broke red that morning, the kind of red that warns of blood before a word's even spoken, and though the air was still, the rancher felt it in his bones, the shift, the quiet dread that settles over land right before it's scarred. A week had passed since her confession, a fragile peace born between them in that span of days, built from small gestures, coffee shared at sunrise, the brushing of hands when passing tools, a silence that no longer felt empty but full of something unnamed and dangerous. But now the calm had weight, the sort that meant it couldn't last. He was fixing the gate when he heard it, the low, rhythmic thunder of hooves rolling over the earth from the east, faint at first, then growing, until the ground itself seemed to hum. He looked toward the horizon and saw the riders cresting the ridge, 5, maybe 6 men, their silhouettes black against the dawn light, their formation too deliberate to be travelers. She stepped out onto the porch as if she'd felt the tremor through the floorboards, her face pale beneath the brim of his old hat she'd taken to wearing. "They've found me," she whispered, the words brittle as glass. He didn't need her to say who they both knew. Without a word, he went to the house, came back with the shotgun, checked the barrels, and stood in front of her on the porch, shoulders squared, the look in his eyes as hard as the land itself. "You stay behind me," he said quietly. "If it goes bad, you take the back trail to the creek and don't look back." She shook her head, trembling but steady in her defiance. "I've been running long enough." Her voice quivered, but her spine held straight, and though fear flashed across her face, it was tempered by something fiercer resolve. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses snorting, dust curling up around them like smoke. The man at the front wore a dark coat despite the heat, his hat pulled low, and when he dismounted, the others followed suit in silent precision. "Morning," the rancher said, his voice calm, though his finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You boys lost?" The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not lost," he drawled, looking past the rancher toward the woman. "Just come to fetch what belongs to Mr. Fletcher. You've got something of his here." She stiffened behind him, her breath catching, and he felt it like a tremor against his back. "Ain't got nothing here that belongs to him," he replied evenly. "Only what I feed and fix with my own hands." The man's smile faded. "Now, see, that ain't how he tells it. Says the lady there's his wife. Says she ran off with something valuable." The rancher's jaw tightened. Maybe she ran 'cause what she was losing was worth more than what she left behind. The tension thickened, the air buzzing with the hum of insects and the restless shifting of horses. The man's hand drifted toward his holster, slow and deliberate. "You making this your fight, cowboy?" he asked. The rancher's eyes didn't waver. "Reckon I already did when I opened my door." The sound that followed was almost imperceptible, the tightening of leather, the faint intake of breath, but it was enough to draw the world taut as a bowstring. The woman's hand brushed his shoulder lightly, a silent plea and a vow all at once, and he felt her trembling ease as she whispered, "No matter what happens, thank you." The riders fanned out slightly, trying to flank, and he shifted to keep her behind him, the shotgun steady though his heart hammered against his ribs. The lead man's eyes flicked up toward the horizon, calculating, cruel. "You think you can stop us?" The rancher's voice was low, resolute, carrying the weight of 10 years of silence and 1 week of purpose. "Don't need to stop you," he said. "Just need to make you remember me." And as thunder rumbled somewhere far off beyond the hills, he cocked the shotgun with a sound that split the morning open, the echo rolling across the plain like a promise that the running for both of them was done. The first shot cracked through the morning like lightning splitting dry timber, a deafening echo that sent the horses rearing and the sky itself seeming to flinch. The rancher's shotgun answered in the same breath, 2 barrels roaring fire and thunder, the recoil jarring his shoulder but the sound giving shape to the fury that had been building in him since the moment those riders came into sight. Dust leapt from the ground where bullets tore into the yard, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood as splinters and dirt stung his face. He moved without thought, instinct older than reason guiding him, ducking behind the water trough, reloading with hands that shook only from adrenaline, not fear, and beside him she crouched, pressing a torn piece of cloth against his arm where a bullet had grazed him, her breath quick but steady. "You're hit," she whispered, her voice trembling but strong. "Ain't dead yet," he growled, teeth clenched, eyes scanning the haze for movement. The riders had scattered, using the corral for cover, their shouts half swallowed by the roar of the wind that had risen with the chaos. He caught sight of one to his left, the glint of a revolver, and fired again, the blast knocking the man from his saddle. The others hesitated then, the certainty in their eyes faltering when they saw the rancher still standing, bleeding but unbroken, his frame silhouetted against the flames of the lantern that had fallen and spilled its oil across the porch boards. Smoke curled upward, the smell of burning wood mixing with the rain-heavy air, and through it all she stayed beside him, refusing to run. Her hand on his back was both anchor and promise, and he realized with a kind of fierce calm that he wasn't fighting just to survive, he was fighting for her right to stand there without chains, to live a life that didn't answer to cruelty. "They're falling back," she said, eyes wide as one of the riders shouted for retreat, dragging his wounded partner toward the horses. The rancher stepped forward then, one last shell loaded, the smoke and dust swirling around him like ghosts, and aimed high, firing into the sky, not at them, but as a warning, a message carved into thunder. "You tell Fletcher," he shouted over the wind, his voice cutting through the chaos. "She ain't his no more. You come again, you'll find graves instead of fences." The remaining men hesitated, faces drawn tight with rage and disbelief, but they turned their mounts, retreating eastward into the rising sun, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon until they were nothing but dust trails swallowed by the distance. The yard fell silent but for the hiss of rain beginning to fall, cooling the smoldering porch and washing the blood into the earth. The rancher lowered the gun, chest heaving, his vision swimming for a moment as the pain in his arm flared sharp and hot. She caught him before he fell, her hands steady despite the tremor in her breath. "Easy now," she said, lowering him to the steps, her face pale but resolute, her eyes bright with something fierce and wordless. He tried to speak, but she pressed a hand to his chest, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered. "You've done enough." But he needed her to understand, needed to say it. "You're free now," he managed, voice ragged. She looked at him then, really looked, the rain streaking her cheeks, the reflection of the dying firelight dancing in her eyes. "No," she said softly, her voice breaking like dawn through shadow. "We both are." He felt her words settle into him deeper than the wound, deeper than the fear, a truth born from struggle and fire. The rain came harder, washing away the blood, the smoke, the footprints of the men who had come to take her, and in its cleansing rhythm he saw her for what she was: not a fugitive, not a ghost of another man's cruelty, but the beating heart that had brought his world back to life. And in her eyes, amid the storm's tears and the ruin of their yard, he saw not fear but belonging, the rare and fragile kind that roots itself in the ashes of survival. When spring finally came, it did not creep softly, it burst across the plains like forgiveness, the air alive with the scent of wet earth and new grass, the hills blushing green where months ago only ash and frost had lived. And as the sun rose over the mended fences and the pasture thick with wildflowers, the rancher stood at the porch and saw what he'd thought he'd never see again: life, in all its stubborn beauty, returning to the land and to him. The scars of the fight were still there, splintered boards, bullet holes patched with fresh wood, but they had become part of the place now, part of the story that no longer hurt to tell. The woman, no longer a stranger, no longer someone running, moved across the yard with quiet purpose, her skirts brushing the dew-damp grass, her hair loose in the morning breeze as she poured feed into the troughs, humming that same song he'd first heard in the storm. She had stayed after that bloody day, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had found something here that the world had never given her before: a choice. And in giving her that, he'd found something, too: the courage to live again, to speak, to laugh, to let another soul close enough to touch the places time and grief had hardened. He watched her now, the way the light caught on her scarred hand, the one that once told a story of pain but now told one of survival, and he felt a swell in his chest that was part pride, part wonder. The horses stirred in the corral, nickering softly, and she turned to him with that small smile that had become his compass through every long day. "You coming, or just gonna stand there staring?" she teased, her voice soft but sure. He grinned, an expression that had once felt foreign but now came easy, and grabbed his hat, stepping down from the porch to join her. They saddled the horses in companionable silence, the kind that comes not from distance but from knowing, from the simple rhythm of two people who had built something together out of ruin. When he swung into the saddle, she was already mounted beside him, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the horizon with the ease of someone who no longer feared what waited beyond it. Together, they rode out across the pasture, the morning sun painting the world in gold, the wind carrying the faint smell of sage and promise. The land stretched wide and forgiving before them, each mile a testament to the second chances life sometimes hides in the dust. He glanced at her, the curve of her smile, the way she fit against the dawn like she'd been carved for it, and felt the old loneliness, the one that used to sit heavy on his chest every sunrise, fade into something lighter, something whole. When they reached the ridge where the land fell away into a sea of green, they stopped for a moment, just breathing, listening to the heartbeat of the world around them. She turned to him then, eyes bright in the sunlight. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked. He thought of the long years of silence, of the ghosts he'd buried, of the night she'd appeared at his fence line and changed everything. "No," he said, voice low, steady. "But I reckon I ain't surprised neither." She laughed softly, the sound carrying across the open land like a prayer answered. The wind tugged at her hair, the horses shifted beneath them, and the ranch below glimmered in the morning light, a place reborn, its story rewritten not by pain, but by the quiet, stubborn power of love that had refused to die. As they turned their horses toward home, riding side by side through the fields he once tended alone, he realized that the frontier, for all its wildness, had given him its rarest gift: a reason to hope again. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light over every scar, every blade of new grass, every breath between them, the rancher knew that some miracles didn't come with thunder or fire, they came with spring, and the sound of two hearts keeping time with the earth.